So let's talk about the prophets among us. As you might have already guessed, there is a lot we could say about prophets. You know, if that word is used 800 times in the Bible and over 150 times in the New Testament, there's a lot that we could say. So we're going to try to pare this down the best we can. As we have said, generally speaking, a prophet is this: the one who questions and reforms. Nathan Brewer, in his book, The Pulse of Christ, he writes this. I like this. He says, prophetic individuals are uniquely gifted by Jesus to creatively connect to and express the Father's heart. When they do this, right, it inspires faithfulness to God and justice in the world. All right, I love that. So one of the key roles that prophets play in the community of faith is they are the most likely to remind us of our obligations towards God. Right? They tend to be a very God-oriented people, right? So they are, in the community of faith, incredibly important for things like keeping faithfulness, keeping the relationship to God open and alive, and also keeping out the things that get in the way, right, from staying connected to God and keeping faithfulness, things like idolatry and distraction and various things. Key words for prophets would be words like this: questioner, reformer, agitator for change. I love that one. Disturbs common thinking and practices. That's great. Got a dirt bike outside my window. Disturbs common thinking and practices. Discernment is a very big one for them. Discerning the heart of God, discerning what's going on in the hearts of people. Authenticity is often very important for prophets, right? They want what is real. Their heart longs for it. And when there's a disconnect between, say, the presentation, like the outward reality, and the inward reality, they're going to pick up on that. Core issues for them is one's relationship with God. And then another key word for them would be urgency, all right? When they are keyed into something being off, when there is sin in the camp, when there is a need that needs to be met, when there's a disconnect between what God calls us to and what we're doing or not doing, they want to see something done about it right now. There's an urgency to them. J.R. Woodward refers to prophets as this. I think this is really helpful language. He refers to prophets as heart revealers. Heart revealers, and this goes two different ways. They reveal God's heart. All right, so they're always looking for God's heart and bringing to the surface to the people of God, this is the heart of God, right? And either we're aligned with it or we're not, but they're also revealers of the hearts of people, which, as you can imagine, is a recipe for conflict, because the Bible has a lot to say about the hearts of people. And just knowing my own heart, there are moments that I'm killing it, and in line with the Spirit and walking with Jesus and operating with pure motivations. But then there's the other 90% of the time when I'm conflicted, right? When my heart wants to wander or be deceitful or make myself look better than I am. Prophets are often very dialed into that and will bring that to the surface. So they have a very disruptive quality in the community of faith at times. And I think this is one of the reasons that prophets can often be misunderstood. They get kind of typecast by people sometimes. Like, man, those people are always negative, right? Or man, they're always pointing out what is wrong. Like, why can't they point out what is right? Why can't they be more positive? Or they can be mistyped or perceived by people as being judgmental, right? And part of this is one of the gifts of the prophet. And by the way, none of those are always very fair, but that can be how they're kind of mistyped. And so this is for prophets, but also for the rest of us. And so, one of the gifts, part of the reason for that is one of the gifts for prophets is they have this unique ability to see behind the curtain, right? So the rest of us operating in our gift in this as, say, apostles or evangelists, shepherd, teachers, while we're dialed into, different spaces and opportunities and needs and busy doing our thing, prophets are the ones that are often dialed into like the thing behind the thing, or if that makes sense, right? They look behind all the other activity and see what's really going on. While the rest of us in The Wizard of Oz, right, we're like taken aback by the beauty of the city and the shimmering buildings and the fire and the presentation on the screen. The prophet in the room is going to be the first one who's peeking behind that curtain saying, yeah, this is bogus. There's something else going on here. Another thing that prophets do is they often are dialed into the heart of the Father and what he desires to do in the world, which means they have an eye for people who are often not being included, or they have an eye for suffering and for brokenness, right? And so one of the gifts that they are to the community of faith is that they're going to bring to the table the voice that isn't being heard, right? Which is another one of the reasons we need them. In the way they operate, they're going to be generally very ethical people. They're going to be very justice-oriented. So in the Bible, we're given, these prophets are often associated with different body parts that I think can give us some insight into who they are, how God has gifted them. So one of those body parts is the ear, which is this image of hearing, right? Hearing the voice of God and obeying, which go hand in hand. So it's this idea of like being open to God, connected to God, receptive to the voice of God and his call to obedience. Another body part that is associated with prophets is the eye, right? Kind of just what we just got done talking about. Being willing and able to see what's going on behind the curtain. And also sometimes, depending on the gifting, like they have this ability to see an event and bring a meaningful interpretation as to what's going on there, right? Where is God in this? Or what does God want to do through this thing that has taken place? And then lastly, another body part that prophets get associated with in the Bible is the heart. And this is a big one. And so it's this idea of like feeling what God feels. And this is, again, part of the reason that being a prophet can be a very difficult and very heavy call. Because if God is angry, the prophet is the one that feels that deeply. And they often become a channel for God's anger, which does happen, right? Because God is holy and we are often not holy. And so that's a difficult space to kind of bridge the gap as a prophet in a way that people can hear and receive. And the same is true if you think about all the emotions of God, like, feeling the expansiveness and overwhelmingness of God's love towards people. They feel that. That's also a very overwhelming place to be. Or the sorrow of God, the brokenheartedness of God. Prophets feel all of those things on a very deep and visceral level. So it can be a very heavy calling compared to the other four. And so all that to say, a big part of their role is to keep the community's relationship with God connected and healthy and open, all of which sounds really positive. But again, if you think about the nature of people and the imperfection and brokenness of people, people generally speaking throughout biblical and human history would rather have religion than God. Right? Can I say that? I mean, it's true. It's true of ancient history, biblical history, modern history. The thing about religion is it typically keeps God at a safe and manageable distance, which I think most of the time, certainly when people are in sin, that's where we would rather have him than up in our business and looking behind our curtain, if you know what I mean. And so for the prophet, a big part of their message then, if they are keeping that relationship to God open and engaged and real and live, that means that a big part of their message oftentimes is some level of repentance, right? Like, you need to change. Like, this isn't right. Something needs to happen here. And none of us, if we're being honest, want that when we're in the wrong, right? We don't want the things that are in us that we've kind of buried unearthed. There are things about us we don't want exposed. And so people don't tend to like, at least initially, some of the things that prophets have to say. So Alan Hirsch says this. He said, this is one of the reasons that when it comes to prophets, we tend to rush at them, kill them, and then later build a monument to them after the fact because we recognize they were right. right? Which sounds kind of harsh, but biblically and historically we know to be very true. And so it can be a somewhat heavy and difficult calling for prophets at times. Another thing about prophets, again, that adds to the weight of their unique calling and gift to the church is that they feel the disparity between the way things ought to be and the way things are. Right? Their heart, when they're walking with Jesus, their heart and soul longs for things to be made right and for the kingdom of God to come in its fullness. And this can include things like righting injustices, caring for the poor, speaking truth to power. Right, again, this is part of their heart because this is a reflection of God's heart, who not only longs for these things, but is committed to writing them and addressing them in human history, in the history and movement of the people of God. But the hard part for prophets is living in the brokenness of the present moment, knowing that things are not the way that they should be, right? It can be very, very hard. It weighs very heavily on a prophet's heart and mind. Now, what I will say is on the positive side, this is precisely why prophets are often, they participate in or they start works that care about these kinds of things, these kinds of kingdom works that reflect the heart of the Father, that require high sacrifice, right? That are heavily involved, that are audacious, right? Things that sometimes don't even make sense on paper, things that most people don't want to do. It's because of this deep level of conviction that prophets live by, right? That they live with. It fuels the fire inside of them. So it's not abnormal for prophets to be starters who start works that don't yet exist, that address these kinds of things that reflect the heart of the Father, or to give themselves to works that already exist that are doing this kind of work. And so, again, just another way that prophets are such an incredible gift to the church and the world. One of the things that can be challenging for prophets is learning that they need to earn the right to be heard, and at times learning that they need to learn to communicate in ways that might be less direct than how they want to communicate, right? And I think this is one of the reasons in the Bible, prophets in the Bible, we often will find adopt things like poetry, right? Or enter into the arts, or they engage in prophetic action, right? Where their life, their activity, what they're doing or what they're abstaining from is actually a message in and of itself, right? So it's not always direct communication, right? Like confrontational, though it can be. It can also be demonstrative, or it can be artful. Interestingly, the word prophet can be translated poet in the secular Greek. So to be a prophet is to be a poet, and to be a poet is to be a prophet. Right? It's an indirect way of communicating something that needs to be heard. Also, if we look at prophets, they tend to have a future orientation, right? There's urgency in the now, but for many of them, they also have a unique perspective as it pertains to the future, right? These are the artists among us. They tend to always be, many of them, ahead of the game. So if you ever want to see where society is going, right, you listen to the prophets, or at least the good ones, right? It's the John Lennons who see all the things that are happening that are broken, or that are wrong, or that need fixing, or that need reform. They pick up on all that nonsense and they speak truth to it. All right, biblical examples of prophets would be certainly Jesus, right? We know for each of these five, Jesus was the perfect embodiment of all five. We find Jesus speaking very prophetic words at times, right? Things like in Matthew 23, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, right? You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you were full of greed and self-indulgence, right? Jesus had no problem at times speaking very hard truth, confrontational truth to places and powers that it needed to be spoken to. We also find in the life of Jesus many times him taking prophetic action where his life and activity is the message, right? So you think about the woman caught in adultery and Jesus getting down in the dirt with her and putting himself in between her and her accusers and writing in the dirt and asking prophetic questions. And we find him doing this a lot of times, right? We could say the same thing of him wrapping a towel around his waist and washing the feet of his disciples. We can say that all the way to the end, picking up a cross, putting on his back, right? And willingly giving his life as he is nailed to the tree, right? That's prophetic action that is speaking a message the world needs to hear in and of itself. Another one would be Nathan in 2 Samuel 12. If you're familiar with the story, he is confronting King David, who has taken a woman to be his wife who was already married. So he's committed adultery. Then he kills off the husband, so he's committed murder. Nathan comes in and he shares this story with David, a metaphor, an illustration. And he talks about, this man who had a lamb who he loved, and he fed it from his table, and it was a part of the family's life and rhythms, and would cuddle it and love it. And this rich man who owned all these sheep, I think 99 or many, and he had a guest come. And instead of sacrificing one of his sheep to prepare a meal for his guest, he goes to the poor man who owns just the one that he loves and has it slaughtered. And Nathan asks King David, so what do you think should be done to this man? And David goes off, right? Like this man should experience the worst of judgment and retribution. And Nathan very prophetically says, you are that man, right? I mean, you talk about a prophetic moment in a confrontational way. Great example. You could go through a lot of the other prophets, ones like Jeremiah throughout the Old Testament. Also, James in the New Testament is a great example of a very prophetic Christian leader. As far as historical and modern examples, we could look at, I think Martin Luther is a quintessential prophet type. Right, we find him squaring off with the religious powers that be. Mahatma Gandhi, he was an incredible prophet, especially in terms of prophetic action. Right, may not have been an explicit follower of Jesus, though he was certainly an admirer and deeply shaped by the way of Jesus. And he went on a number of hunger strikes to confront unjust governing practices and to advocate for mistreated people. Bono, right? Probably aging myself with this one. Love Bono. I've read many books along the way on him, but very prophetic in his sphere of influence. Over the years, we find him championing what became an international response to the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And in his lifetime, who knows how many tens of thousands of miles he has flown to meet with politicians and global leaders to contend for nations burdened by debt and short on resources. We've said already named John Lennon would be another great example. Outspoken truth teller who is sadly another prophet taken from us way too young. And another example that I love that probably will ring true for many is Martin Luther King. Right? Advocate for racial justice, spoke truth to power, but not simply with words, though he was certainly gifted with prophetic words, but just as powerful, maybe more so, was his radical prophetic action, right? Nonviolent resistance in the way of Jesus was the essence of his message, right? And so those are some biblical and modern historical examples. Another thing I would say about prophets is prophets can, as you're probably picking up on, be very different from one another. And so I found it helpful, if we were in the room physically together, I would write on a whiteboard an X and Y axis, right? One vertical, one horizontal. Prophets, as we mentioned, tend to be very God-oriented people, right? So think about that vertical line. They are very dialed into the covenant between God's people and God himself, deeply committed to holiness, many of them, right? These would be the vertically oriented prophets. Now in unhealth, right, and then the horizontal, we'll just say horizontal is more, we're talking about horizontal realities in the world, right? We've talked about confronting oppression, feeding the poor, caring for the prisoner, the foreigner, the alien. You can have unhealth in both ways when it comes to prophets. You can have prophets who are so vertically oriented, so into the spiritual practices, so deeply committed to being connected with God in prayer, and yet have no regard for their neighbor or what God desires to do in the world. And on the other hand, you can have, on the horizontal axis, very unhealthy prophets. In the most extreme cases would be somebody like an activist who doesn't pray, right? And so one of the helpful really helpful kind of self-assessment or coaching tools for prophets and journeying together is, real health for a prophet is not one or the other, right? It's not just vertical, it's not just horizontal, it's both, right? And so imagine me filling in the middle of that axis, like spiritual maturity is in there. And so it can be very helpful for prophets to kind of think about that, where they're at in their journey with Jesus currently, right? Which way are they strong, and which way does God perhaps want to grow them? So lastly, I know I've gone a little long, and when I'm just sitting in front of a microphone, I'm going to probably tend to go a little longer than even usual. But here are some challenges for prophets. Because of the weight that they feel and the rejection that they inevitably experience at times, prophets can find themselves into places of despair. And if you think about it, this was true of a number of prophets in the Old Testament. Some of them at times were literally begging God to just take their life because they were just so discouraged and depressed. This was true of Jesus at times, where he was overwhelmed with despair, given the state of things and the cup that God put before him. And so it probably shouldn't be surprising that if it was true of them, it's going to be true of you at times as well, if you're gifted prophetically. And if it's not despair, it's probably woundedness. Prophets can be a pretty wounded people because they're often misunderstood or because that their voice has gone unheard. I think it's really important for all of us to know this about our brothers and sisters who are gifted prophetically, because finding a spot can be so difficult, and they can be so misunderstood, and the church doesn't always know what to do with the prophets. And so I think it's really important for us to know this so that we can lean in and extend grace and graciously extend space for their voice to be heard. Another challenge for prophets at times can be contentment, right? And this is we need to recognize this is connected to their gift, right? So discontentment with the way things are is part of what drives prophets. It's part of what makes them great. It's part of the fuel in their fire that leads to so many kingdom works and calling God's people back to him, right? But one of the skill sets and maturity for the prophets is learning to differentiate between holy and unholy discontent, because not all discontentment is holy. And one of the best places to grow in that discernment is in the community of faith. Prophets, just like the rest of us, they have to have other people around them in order to grow, in order to rightly discern what's going on, and also to keep them in the game. And to that point, one of the challenges for prophets in this regard, very important for you to understand if you're gifted prophetically, is one of the challenges for prophets is staying committed and engaged with a community of faith. And what you think about, I think probably makes a lot of sense, because prophets are often the ones really tuned into the disconnect between what is and what should be, what a community says they're about, and what they actually do or don't do, right? They're reading the core values on the website, right? They have a finely tuned BS meter, right? When there is a disconnect, when somebody's blowing smoke, when there's a lack of authenticity, they're generally the ones that are first tuned into it. They pick up on the inconsistencies between what is said and what actually is or isn't being done. So being a part of the community of faith can be really, really hard on prophets. And when a prophet is immature, or they give into that sense of urgency, right? Because again, prophets are like, this needs to be done now. This needs to be done now. This is close to the heart of God. Why are we putting this off? Right? That's why prophets also, they need the shepherds who are caring for the people in the room and who are long suffering. And they need the teachers who are saying, hey, we need to grow in this. And it might take us 5 years for God to grow us in what we need to understand and respond to, right? And we could just go down the line. Prophets need others around them in this regard. And sometimes in unhealthiness, prophets will bounce from community faith, from church to church to church. In discouragement and despair, sometimes they'll pull away from church entirely and really have no real ongoing active life in a community of faith. And it's incredibly sad because of how much the church misses out on and how much they miss out on. but unfortunately it's really common. So like one of the most important competencies for prophets is learning to live in the tension of what is and what ought to be. Super, super important. At their best, where they tend to grow and be their most healthy selves, even if it's hard, is when they stay committed and engaged to a community of faith and lovingly work for change from within, right? Where they learn over time how to share what they see that can be heard in a way that can be heard and received by other people. And when they do, friends, when they do, God uses prophets to be like a compass for the community, helping us make sure that we remain pointed towards true north and actively engaged with the heart of God. Like, it's really hard to imagine God's people being faithful without prophets. So prophets, we need you. I feel for the weightiness of your calling, but know that it's so important and you have such a key role to play, both in our community here on the ground in Knoxville or wherever God has you. Grace and peace, friends.